Good evening, everyone. I'm Robert Doerr, the president of the American Enterprise Institute. Now, I don't often introduce our events, but I like to show up for ones that are particularly important to me and to AEI. And tonight, we have Johns Hopkins University President Ronald J. Daniels in the building to discuss with AEI Senior Fellow Jenna Storey an urgent question. Can the left and right learn together at America's universities? This event is part of an ongoing effort by Jenna and many of our scholars to address the biggest challenges facing American higher education today. Free speech, free inquiry, reasoned debate, viewpoint diversity, and the broader ideal of liberal education that have defined the best of our colleges for decades are at risk. For the past 2 years, Jenna and many of our other scholars have been researching and writing and hosting conversations to better understand, evaluate, and address these issues. Ultimately, we want to defend and revitalize the values and institutions of liberal education for students today and for future generations. So I'm very pleased to have such a high-profile guest in the building today who shares our concerns and our commitment to public dialogue. So with that, I'd like to turn the conversation over to Jenna. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Robert, for providing that welcome, and thank you to the American Enterprise Institute for being such a welcoming home to my husband, Ben, and myself. We work together on issues concerning higher education, and we actually were university professors for quite a long time. We loved that work. We were loving teaching, researching all the core things that professors do, and although we've left academia, we still think that work is crucially important. We think that universities are crucial to the health of our country and that they play a key role in American life. Now, since we've come to AEI 2 years ago, that position has become an increasingly lonely one. I don't know if you've seen recent articles or polls, but only 36% of the American public now have confidence in higher education, we're told. And that's down 20 points from only 8 years ago. Some people in the universities are frustrated by this, understandably. Some of them are saying things, though, that aren't particularly productive to the ongoing conversation. And what I appreciate so much about President Ronald Daniels is that although he's a highly accomplished academic and a much admired university leader, he is not sitting up in some ivory tower telling the American people that they need to wake up or wise up to all the good that universities do for them. He is pointing that out, but he's also doing a lot of work to talk to university people too, and to show them how they need to realize how much they owe to our country, and to make them realize that they need to think about how they could do their public duty better. This is all very beautifully laid out in a recent book that President Daniels has published with Grant Shreve and Philip Spector. It's called What Universities Owe Democracy. He published this 2 years ago, and when I came across this book, I knew immediately that I wanted to talk to him. So thank you very much for coming out tonight for your first visit to the American Enterprise Institute and for our first conversation.
It's great to be here, Jenna. Thanks so much for the invitation. So looking forward to having the opportunity to talk with you.
Great. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about President Daniels and then start a conversation, after which I'll open it to the audience for questions. President Daniels has served in his current position at Johns Hopkins University for 14 years, during which time he's overseen some very important initiatives and has made a distinctive mark on the institution. There are many, many things I could mention, but I'm going to highlight just a few that are quite relevant to our topic this evening. The first concerns social mobility. President Daniels and his team have taken seriously the duty that elite institutions have to make good on the American dream. And so he has greatly increased financial aid for lower income students, and he has also overseen the ending of legacy admissions. Second, I want to talk about academic freedom. Johns Hopkins is proactive on this issue. When students come to campus, they are introduced to the history of, the importance of academic freedom right during the orientation period. Johns Hopkins has also instituted a number of programs that host debates among public intellectuals who disagree about important issues, between professors who disagree, and between students over the course of their 4 years of education. Johns Hopkins has also been quite innovative in the area of civic education and open dialogue, and doing research to support democratic institutions. And I'll highlight just two ways in which they've been innovative in this respect. One is the Agora Institute, which recently opened on the home campus, and the other is the Hopkins Bloomberg Center, which just last week opened up right near Capitol Hill. Prior to serving at Johns Hopkins, President Daniels was professor of law and provost of the University of Pennsylvania. And before that, he was the dean of the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. He holds undergraduate and law degrees from the University of Toronto and a master's in law degree from Yale. So we have about a half an hour to talk here, after which it's your turn. And for our part of the conversation, there are basically three things I'd like to cover. First of all, what motivated you to write about the public duty of universities? And then secondly, in what ways, I want to know, you think universities aren't living up well enough to their public duties? And third, I want to move to talking about what they can do to remedy this. So first of all, what motivated you to write this book? I want to say it's significant to me that you are the president of our country's first research university and one of its most preeminent research institutions. And when that university was founded, it was commonly thought that support for the scientific enterprise and the development of a scientific mindset was the most important way that higher education could contribute to our country's public life. And now you write that you've realized that while the scientific enterprise is very important, it's not enough. It's not sufficient to fulfill the university's civic duty. So how did you come to realize this? And what else do universities need to offer?
So thanks, Jennifer, for the question. And let me just acknowledge, sitting in the back of the room there is Phil Spector, who's been my colleague along with Grant Shreve in the book, as you mentioned earlier. And Phil, thanks for joining us for this event. So how did I come to the book? I think it started off, and it actually goes to something that you mentioned a few moments ago, and that is the diminishing public trust, expressed trust in higher education, in particular elite higher education. And this is something, of course, that it's not just new to this moment. This has been underway for a number of years. And of course, we also know that embedded within that diminishing public trust is also something quite striking, which is, of course, the different views of Republican and Democratic citizens as to how they regard the role of universities and whether or not they are or not aligned with the public interest. And of course, you know the story, which is that both Republicans and Democrats their trust in universities is decreasing, but the rate of decline for Republican voters is much more dramatic. And so, you know, you would, as you might imagine, I think the dominant narratives of trying to understand what's going on within the academy has been very much framed in terms of backlash against elite institutions, rise of populism, just a real growing distrust in all established institutions. And so it's not surprising that universities are rolled up into that. And so woe is us. That this is in some sense exogenous to the institution, we're reacting to it. But I think the dominant narrative was one which actually has attenuated the degree of agency that we have, at least in the story. And that's not to say that the broader polarization, the discord, a lot of these things in terms of rising populism, distrusted institutions, these aren't real factors. They are, of course. But that doesn't mean that we don't have some agency, some responsibility, some ownership for part of the story. And I think particularly over the last decade, the more that these trends continue to accelerate, the more it seemed to me that it was incumbent upon those of us who are in universities to be able to ask and answer the question, what role do we have in all this? And that is to say that particularly to the extent that you see, not just within this country, but indeed internationally, a declining level of support and commitment in liberal democracy, that, you know, the question is, what do the core institutions and the people who operate in those core institutions, what responsibility do they have? So that's the scene setting for this. And as I started to think about more and more about that issue, what was really striking was that although there's fragments that are out there in terms of what is the case for the role of the university in democracy, actually the story was not connected in a comprehensive and systematic way. So the first thing that I thought was really important in the book was to build a clear case for how does the university fit into democracy? What are the ways in which we either contribute to its flourishing or undermine its performance? And then from there, do, as you said a moment ago, begin to systematically evaluate whether we're doing all that we can as an institution to contribute to the flourishing of democracy, or to what extent is there something that we are doing that is, again, contributing to the challenges it faced. And so it's in that context very quickly that I arrayed with Grant and Phil the argument that the university, first and foremost, is an indispensable institution for liberal democracy. And the ways in which that matters are the four key ways in which we argue that the university matters for liberal democracy is one, in terms of the way in which the university at its best promotes social mobility, truly instantiates the commitment to equal opportunity, takes people, gives them the opportunity, those people of talent and of ambition, and gives them the opportunity to rise above their circumstances. And we know the connections between high levels of social mobility and trust in democracy. So that's one way in which we have a very obvious role, and not just in terms of increase in human capital formation, but all the other benefits that come with having received the gift of a university education. In terms of full membership in democratic society, better life expectancy, better and longer relationships, all these things that we know empirically are associated with university education. The second way in which I think a university plays a really critical, nay, indispensable role is in imparting an understanding of history and culture and the civics of the country of which we're a part, and seeing not only does this fall to the university, it's also K-12 education, but the university can be a key actor in implanting an understanding of the obligations, the context for the exercise of your responsibilities as a citizen. So that's a second key role that the university plays. The third key role is the one that we, of course, know well in terms of the peculiarities of the institution, tenure, academic freedom, all of these features that people see us as a somewhat unusual institution. Well, it's all, of course, in furtherance of the role the role that we play in uncovering, producing knowledge, verifying, doing our best to verify claims to truth and fact, and again see that as a critical end. We're not the only institution in a democracy that plays that role, but I think we're an important bulwark institution in that regard. And then the final, and I think important way in which we contribute to democracy is the way in which we take students, and we were just discussing this a moment ago, but take students who at a tender age come to university, leave home, and join communities that are really heterogeneous, that take them from, when we do this well and assemble really diverse and interesting and complex classes, but take them from their neighborhoods and the enclaves where they see a lot of sameness and put them in a world that is much more heterogeneous. And it's in that sense that I think that affords us a really interesting opportunity to really model pluralism and to again play a role in equipping our graduates for the responsibilities of citizenship and how one thinks about being an effective citizen in an increasingly diverse and pluralistic community. So it's those things that I thought were really important to set out and to be and to develop the framework for then moving to the question of how we're doing against that.
Good. Okay. So as you can tell, the book has four parts, and they're interlocking. It's a very complex historical account of how those four ways in which universities have contributed to democracy work together. I'm going to focus on really mostly two of those planks, though, today. And the first one I want to ask about is civic education. And I have basically two questions about that I think probably are best answered together. So the first is, a lot of people say that civic education is really something we should be doing in K-12. And they're not sure what place it could have in a university life. It seems like we learn some stuff in K-12 and then we go to the university and question it, is one way it's often put to us. And so I want to get your view on that. And I think that kind of intersects with this other question, which is that if we're going to have a civic education that seems like a real civic education for the whole country, it has to seem like it's salutary to both the left and the right, right? And I've noticed that people on the left and the right tend generally to approach civic education differently. To kind of simplify it or caricature it, people on the right concentrate much more on knowledge, on history, on understanding how institutions work, and people on the left tend to concentrate on the development of skills, the capacity for and the taste for civic action. So how do you talk about how universities should contribute to civic education, and how do you design a civic education that draws from the best in what both the left and right have to say?
So Jenna, I think it starts first and foremost, you asked the question of, what's the role of the university as against K-12 education? I think, in a first-press world, there would be comprehensive and uniform civics education in K-12, but we know that's not the case in this country. And in fact, the level of civics education, formalized civic education in this country is truly lamentable. And relatively, again, as this group will know well, relatively low percentage of Americans have had any exposure to civics education. For me, there was the epiphany on this came when I was doing a seminar course in preparation for this book. And I was teaching a group of students, and I said, I'm a little concerned about the state of civics education, but you're at Johns Hopkins. This is a tough institution to get into. Surely you've all had some exposure to American political philosophy, the institutions of American government. You've had a series of courses and exposures over the course of your career. Just, could any of you who haven't had that, it was probably a bad question, raise your hand. And what was amazing were the number of hands that went up, and kind of confirmed, other moments when I've interacted with the students. Another key moment years ago is when we started to formally, in the first week you mentioned this a moment ago, teach students the rudiments of academic freedom and tie that into free expression, the role the First Amendment plays in American society. And I was a little worried that this was going to be just too pedantic first week of classes for undergraduates. Surely they've been exposed to this before. And the number of students who came out of that session saying, no one ever told us. So for me, this starts with that there is a remedial component to this in universities that in an ideal world, this would be happening in K-12. It's not. And given that, I think, again, just given that what so many of us feel is the fragility of our norms and the moment that we have in American society, I think it's really incumbent upon us in higher education to step into the breach. Now, having said that, I do think you're right that the left and the right do emphasize different components of what it means to provide comprehensive civics, and obviously, however you come out on this, in the ideological spectrum, you'd have to tailor this to a university audience when you think about it in a higher education setting. But I'm really encouraged by the number of bipartisan efforts that are out there that have been able, in the context of K-12 education, to come up with a comprehensive multi-year curriculum. And I look at it and I think it actually does very nicely represent a comprehensive and thoughtful approach to these issues that reminds us that we still can, I think, understand and articulate what it means to be part of this great country and the democratic experiment in which we are involved. So I think that's possible, and I think, again, although one would think about these design issues differently in a university setting, I think they're entirely possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems to me like there's a natural relationship and symbiosis between the way that the right and the left approach civics education, which I found actually partly articulated in your book, because just knowledge of things without the ability to act is not helpful,
Right.
but also action without information and knowledge is not helpful, right? So it seems to me that is precisely those two sides, which you articulate as four different things in your book, seem to be naturally in symbiosis, but someone needs to bring those together and kind of stop the squabbling
Absolutely.
about
And
it.
I think this is one of the things that when one looks at where American universities have been over the last several decades and the contributions they, if asked, they feel they're making to this agenda, they would say, well, we got this whole service learning out there, that we're sending our students out there doing volunteer work, they're interacting with community organizations and seeing how you do advocacy, how you deliver services. But I worry that's still without knowledge of the core institutions of American government and without an appreciation of the ideas and the values that one sees as intimately bound up with this enterprise of making democracy work.
Right. So to really contribute to something, you have to know it well.
Exactly.
Right? And I think that's well represented in the book. I want to ask you now about the fourth chapter of your book, which you call Purposive Pluralism. And you acknowledge in your book that universities are struggling to deal with the increasing diversity in our society and the increasing diversity in their institutions, and also the polarization of our politics. You point out that universities, because they bring so many different people together, so many different students together, are or should be the place to deal with this. You say they should be the world's models of how to talk to one another across the divides of identity and ideology. But you also say, instead, they've come to be seen as places of tension and fracturing. So I first want to ask the why question. How did this come to pass? How did universities come to be seen as places of tension and fracturing? And to the degree that they are, why is that?
So I think there's probably a number of different factors here. One level has been, I think, just simply this represents a microcosm of the broader society of which we're part, and the changes in modes of behavior and kinds of interaction we see generally in society, and not surprisingly, that's represented in the university. So I think in part we're reflective of, and then of course magnify and contribute to some of these trends. I think in part it reflects what I see as sort of the unfulfilled diversity agenda over the last several decades, which has been, we want to think seriously about opportunity. We know that there are groups that have been traditionally grossly underrepresented in universities. We can't seem to make way with it. Then we provide intentionality and we're able to assemble these classes. And then I think for a lot of folks, the work stops here. We've got representation. We have greater representation across racial, religious groups. We have national representation. We've now increasingly sensitive to the importance of getting socioeconomic representation. And so that marks achievement, and that does, but it, to my mind, is only the condition precedent for then what do you do with this really diverse group of students that have come into the university, and how do you actually start to take advantage of these different perspectives? And again, knowing how polarized we are, how can you do something in this really intense 4-year experience that students have within our universities that actually introduces them to modes of interaction, types of behavior, kinds of interrogation, debate, and so forth, that is different than what they're used to coming from much more homogeneous communities than they confront in the university. And I think we've had a hard time with that. One of the things that when we looked at the empirical literature, and there are studies on this, it's really striking to see, and again, so much attention on deplatforming, when it does happen on university campuses, when you have a single speaker and that person is unable to speak or is disinvited and so forth. These moments which happen infrequently, but when they do happen, they attract a lot of attention. But what was really interesting is when we looked even at the types of events that take place on university campuses, how infrequently you actually have debates where left and right are in a dialogue, modeling types of behavior and being able to, in some sense, show the possibilities for fellow citizenship and friendship, even in the face of very divergent views, either underlying values or divergent views about the empirical state of the world that animate those differences. So it's things like that I think we have done, not having that kind of those moments where we structure interactions and model the kinds of conversations one would want to have that ultimately, I think, better equip our students for graduation on graduation as they enter into professional life and so forth. I think another, it seems so simple, but it's really quite striking that, the way in which over the last several decades we have just succumb to the interest on the part of our students in basically finding roommates literally from the first year, finding roommates on their own without us actually randomly structuring students in living situations where they're forced to meet people whose backgrounds, perspectives are very different from their own. That's something that we just, over the decades, we've given up on. And surprise, surprise, when students select their roommates coming into university, in advance of getting to us, they've already found people who are, again, very familiar to them, comfortable to them. And so instead of actually taking advantage of the diversity of the representation that we've achieved, you're actually reinforcing the communities or the perspectives that they're leaving behind. So I think it's examples like these where I think even small perturbations and how you think about taking advantage of the heterogeneity of our student bodies, but to really try and create moments where you're showing the best of pluralistic interaction and creating a kind of hopefulness about what it means to function cheek by jowl with one another in a society where we may feel very differently about certain issues, have different aspirations, but fundamentally, we can maintain a sense of community.
Mm-hmm. This is a very interesting part of the book, and I think you make a great point about the way in which universities have concentrated their efforts of diversity on it in the admissions process, getting diverse students in, and not enough on the process of teaching them how to interact or setting up the situations in which they might learn how to interact. And I want to get back to that and hear more about what you're doing on that. But I do want to ask about one place in the university in which there is not a lot of diversity. And it's an issue I'm really grateful for you raising. There's not a lot of diversity on the faculty in terms of their political affiliations, right? The number of conservatives and Republicans in academia is falling every year. It's down to practically unsustainable numbers. Only 6 to 11% of faculty in humanities and social sciences identify as conservative or Republican, depending on what kind of study you follow. And I think this is important not only as a sort of faculty issue, but probably for the questions that you're raising about how students interact. I want to get your opinion about this. We know that students have a hard time making friends across the political divide. It's interesting and surprising if you look at these studies, or you do one, as I did at my university, to find that actually students have a relatively easy time making friends across other divides, racial divides, geographic divides, religious divides, gender divides of all kinds. But political friendships are really hard for them to have. That's just, as you say, a microcosm of the larger society in some way. But I'm going to ask a series of questions about your observation that there are so few conservatives in academia and that this might be a problem. Why do you think that's a problem? Do you think that is a problem for the way in which adults are modeling the kind of political interactions that we are hoping to see in students? And what might be done about it?
So let me start off and say, I think it is a problem, and I think it's an important challenge for us to address with some intentionality and urgency, particularly given all the things that we're talking about that are tearing at the fabric of our country. So let me say where I don't think it's a problem and where I do believe it has more salience. So Hopkins faculty looks, I think, strikingly similar to the faculty of a number of our peer institutions. Same sort of left progressive overweight in the composition of the professorate. It's undeniable. Do I think, and I've, again, as I do my soundings with students, do I think our students, when they're in a political philosophy course, do I think they are introduced to the ideas of conservatism, to different political perspectives in a fair, perhaps even sympathetic way? I do. I think our faculty understand that obligation, and I think that is fairly conveyed. And I also think that it's, again, when one looks at the empirics of this, what happens to students after they graduate from university? Do you find, for instance, that students their worldview and particularly their political orientation is fundamentally changed by the university experience? The truth is, it looks pretty resilient. I was just talking to Michael Crow yesterday from Arizona State University. He's actually done a recent study where they looked at before, after, where the students come in and ultimately how they identify graduation. He says he's split about 50-50 in terms of the composition of the student body between Republicans and Dems. He says by and large on graduation, they stay in. And it may be there's some that cross the line, but fundamentally it looks remarkably durable. So I think students are exposed to, even by Democratic or progressive faculty, get exposure to some of these ideas. I think that they still on graduation show some durability in the attachment of the political affections, commitments they have. So it's to my mind, it's less about that, and I think it is more, to my mind, about the way in which the lack of conservatives on our campuses have impoverished the quality of debate across the university on a range of different issues. And it's here that, and it goes back to, I think, the broader questions of polarization that we see within American society. It seems to me there's a very significant lost opportunity for universities when on any of a number of different issues, you actually don't have conservatives who are on the faculty who are actually able to engage with faculty on the other side of the political divide, with students who have different political perspectives. And we don't have that kind of interaction, debate, deliberation that I think would be enriched by having more conservatives as a member of our community. I think also, and you can just see the extent to which this becomes reinforcing, the fact that you don't have conservative faculty who in turn are mentoring, training, helping students through doctoral programs, again, I think further exacerbates this deficit in the conversation that we need to have. And I think what's really unfortunate is, the way in which we see more of these debates happening in institutions outside of the university and not actually taking place on the campuses, where I think it just makes everyone sharper, more careful, more thoughtful in how they articulate their positions if they have to confront confront those challenges from within the faculty. So I think this is an important issue for us in a way that, as I say to any of a number of different disciplines, when you are thinking about, you're in the economics department and you're thinking about recruiting a new faculty member for a very scarce line, that you will have that debate within the department. Should it be a theoretician? Should it be an empiricist? Should it be someone who's doing micro or macroeconomics? What particular fields of micro? We have those discussions all the time about prioritization and recognizing that there are things that we need to do as a university and expertise that we need to have and orientations that we need to have that we deliberately recruit for in our faculty. And I think this is a totally legitimate and important consideration for us to have, is to say, particularly in a setting where we are so seriously divided as a country, and not having that perspective on the faculty there to participate, to model for students, to mentor, I think impoverishes us.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I appreciate, again, that you raised this issue. It's a hard one to raise in the university context. And the even harder question is what can be done about it. I also appreciate that in the conclusion of your book, you point out that there's only so much that academic leadership can do because of the nature of shared governance in university institutions and also the longstanding habits of consultation and conversation after conversation, which is very specific to university life, and not so.
But I am optimistic about it.
Yeah.
I do say that is true, that we are, there's lots of veto points, there is a premium on consultation and deliberation, but I actually do feel the ability to raise these issues and to challenge the faculty. My experience has been over the years, and I've been doing academic leadership for decades now in a number of different settings, but I'm actually quite optimistic about the capacity of arguments of principle that can draw on empirical support. So they do move the academy, but it requires persistence, I think, in being willing to engage these issues. But again, I think this is a sense of again, if we honor this moment and say, where are we and what obligations do we have? And as I've said at the outset, are we either exacerbating or are we addressing some of the strains in American society? I think that's a useful way to help folks to see that we got to think about this issue differently.
Mm-hmm. And one thing you point out, again, in the conclusion, that a lot of people who don't work in universities maybe don't understand. They say, you point out, they're very slow moving, right? They're designed to be slow moving, to have a lot of consultation and conversation. And that can be very frustrating to people who stand outside of them. But the advantage of that, you also point out, is that change, when it happens, is enduring, right? They don't flip and flop, right? So they come up with a new way of doing things, and it lasts for generations, for centuries, right? And so if we can get this inflection moment right, and pose the questions, and I hear you saying that when faculty basically hire their own in their departments, you're encouraging them to consider political diversity as one of the factors along the other factors of specialization and so forth that they can serve. And that's something that an administrator can do that might have some effect. And it'd be very interesting to see what effect that does have, right? We're at the beginning of an experiment.
No doubt it irritates people, but
yeah, it has that effect.
So but that's true of a number of things that we do. So there's nothing new in that. But I actually do think that again, this sense of the mismatch between the country of which we are part and the inability in terms of having people who are really devoted to this orientation, being on faculty, being seen to be a site for creative, scholarly work in that area. I think we miss something.
Good.
We diminish ourselves.
Okay, so my last question or set of questions is, you have many accomplishments at Johns Hopkins, even many accomplishments that address the problems we're talking about tonight, but what is the one you're most proud of? And what is one that you hope to do in the coming years?
So, the one that one of that I'm very proud is the work that we did around really thinking seriously about increasing access to the institution, in particular with the great extraordinary gift that we received from Mike Bloomberg, $1.8 billion to our undergraduate financial aid program to really help us dramatically increase the pathways to a university education. And so that is one of the great moments as president when we were able to announce that gift. But part of that was a decision that I'm still perplexed as to why we're feeling so lonely on this issue, and that is our decision to end legacy admissions. So here's one that I find really interesting, and this is my background, as indicated a few moments ago. So I'm a Canadian. I'm now an American citizen. I'm a dual citizen. But left a country that, in truth, talks less about equal opportunity than this country does, and so saw this idea as a very powerful, animating idea of the country, and got here and found this norm or this practice of legacy admissions, namely that students who apply to lead higher education at a number of different institutions get a significant assist when it comes time to admitting them into university. And to my mind, this seemed to, as my wife, whose politics are slightly different than mine, would say, so there's your affirmative action program for kids who have had every advantage in life. How do you justify the continuation of this program? And it gave me pause. And so ultimately, we decided to end legacy admissions at Hopkins. Obviously, in the wake of the Supreme Court decision this past year, there has been a significant debate that has unfolded in this country. And it's interesting to see the convergence of both left and right critics around the continuation of this practice. But having said that, it still seems pretty durable and well entrenched. Since the time that we announced this several years ago, there's been just a few institutions that have declared themselves legacy free. And so, that was a decision where we had hard conversations with some of our graduates and who really saw this as almost a solemn compact that they really had a sense of expectation that this would continue. And yet, I felt really fortunate that the leadership, the board, supported us as we made that change. And so that that's one which I feel really good about. In terms of one thing that we're excited about and hope to do is that, as some of you may know, we vacated our real estate on Mass Ave. Anyone here interested in buying it? We would welcome an opportunity to talk further with you. I tried to persuade Robert that this is a great building, but you could have more real estate. But we've moved to, of course, the renovated museum building that's on Pennsylvania Avenue. And one of the things that we're doing there is that not only have we relocated the School of Advanced International Studies, which formerly was, of course, just down the block, to that site, but we're opening a new School of Government and Policy, and really, really excited about the opportunity to contribute to public policy debate in Washington, and to be able to draw on the distributed strengths of Hopkins, particularly in the science and technology areas, which we think will give us some purchase in some of the debates that take place here in Washington. So really excited about that.
Okay. Well, thank you. Now it's time for your questions. And we will have someone around with a microphone. Would you please state your name and affiliation before you pose your question? So,
Excellent. Thank you, President Daniels, for being here. My name is Eric Tapia. I work here in D.C. for the Council of Graduate Schools. So I actually came from a low socioeconomic background and a conservative upbringing. And I want to drill down into this point of the pipeline for PhDs, because I got mine. And the pipeline wasn't very large. How do we increase that to get more students from that background into the doctoral levels?
So, first and foremost, it's like everything else in the university. If it's a priority, you got to find the resources. Just to say it's a priority, but then to not think about the financial investments you'll make is problematic. So that's obviously a piece of this. And typically, PhD education, among all the priorities that we take out to our alumni for fundraising and so forth, doesn't figure as prominently, particularly in comparison to the undergraduate program. So I think that's part of it. I think it goes back to, if you're talking about first, and I'm going to separate low socioeconomic status from conservative. On low socioeconomic status, it's really interesting how, I will say, particularly from the vantage point of a place like Hopkins, when I talk to my colleagues on the faculty, say, how can we bring more low socioeconomic status students into the professoriate so that get them into PhD programs, but very much with the view of getting them onto the professoriate. And it's been really interesting, particularly in a place like Hopkins, which has such a strong life science, health science focus. And as I started to talk to some of my colleagues who were sort of the leading the large section courses where they were identifying students of talent and could direct them, said, I've never really thought about the extent to which so many of those students come here and they think that the single best thing to do is to become a doctor or go into one of the professions. Said, I've always thought, because how powerful that destination is for them and for their families, I never thought about actually trying to push them in a different direction and see the importance of getting them to think about PhD education and ultimately entering the professoriate. So so we've done a bit of a pivot, and we have now more mentorship programs and really trying to be more systematic in identifying students who you recognize that it's not as natural to think about that pathway into the professoriate as it is for people who have actually the second or third generation to come from, who have been in university. The conservative piece, I think, goes back to what I said a moment ago. I think this is again another reason why you want conservatives on the professoriate. I think, again, to model, to mentor, to inspire, and I think, again, it's not that I'm accusing colleagues who are progressive of not teaching the subject matter, but there's something more that we do in our roles that I think, again, this becomes a powerful way in which you increase the pipeline. So I think these are all connected.
Okay. Oh, first, Matthew.
Hi, my name is Claude Martins. I am a journalist in town, but I'm here also because I'm very interested in higher ed and very active in my alma mater, Washington University in St. Louis. And I had a question for you. How do schools like Hopkins and WashU strike a balance between giving students a solid liberal arts education versus also training them for jobs? Obviously, it's they're not. It's not, college is not a vocational school, but you want to come out with skills. How do you strike that balance, and what can schools do better to prepare students for the ever-changing world?
So, and I know Jenna thinks a lot about this issue in terms of liberal education and how you best achieve the goals of liberal education. Particularly in a setting where the trend over the last several decades in higher education is to give students more and more choice and offer more and more opportunities for specialization. One of the things we've done is, on ensuring the rudiments of a liberal education is to introduce a little more structure back into the curriculum at Hopkins. And Hopkins has been, I think, at probably one end of the continuum, giving much more scope to students for choice than perhaps in other institutions. We don't have, on the Columbia model, a core curriculum, so it's not nearly that structured. But there is a movement back in trying to ensure that there's a little more constrained choice, and that's and that you could be confident some of the competencies, the knowledge that we associate with a liberal education is achieved through a curriculum. At the same time, I think what we have been, I think, effective at has been to encourage students to do the things that make them really happy, that they're interested in, where they find personal intellectual reward and fulfillment, and then to spend a lot of time with them in thinking about the ways in which you can take a major in humanities and still think about the path that will allow you to ultimately, if making money is important to you, to be able to achieve a level of financial security and have sort of options through the kinds of other experiences you have at university that will make you more marketable. But I keep coming back to that this is such a precious and truly unique moment in your life, that the thing that I think is really important is to say, take a moment, really pursue these issues or ideas or exposure to areas of knowledge that you have the opportunity here, which is really, as we all know, is increasingly hard to find once you graduate, and to see the opportunities for professional education, other things that can follow that 4-year period that will allow you to get greater financial security. I will also say the other thing that's been really interesting at Hopkins is just to see the extent to which you're getting more and more students double majoring or doing a major in the humanities and a minor in business, so doing English literature and a minor in business, and trying to think about how they ready themselves for careers that allow them to be more effective and perhaps achieve greater levels of financial security, but nevertheless still follow their passion. So I think that too has been a really interesting trend.
Good. John Stanford, you have a question? Wait just one moment for the microphone, please.
John Stanford from the University of Florida. I had a question about civic education as it relates actually to sort of faculty ideological imbalance. I was involved and still am involved in creating a civics education center at the University of Florida. And one thing that I discovered over the course of the past year is that the ideological imbalance at the University of Florida has led to certain holes in the curriculum that I think are actually nationwide. So for example, we don't really have anyone who focuses on early American history, political thought, legal thought, et cetera. And I think that this is true across the country. That is, as we've been trying to recruit people and hire people, it looks like PhD lines in those areas have kind of dried up because decisions have been made not to study those areas. And so if civics education is in part about imparting knowledge, and part of that would be knowledge of the American founding, right? So I guess I'd make a suggestion that maybe university administration can do more than encourage departments to look for ideological diversity, but also maybe think through substantively what do we want in civic education, and then maybe be a little bit more directive to the faculty about we want people with these areas of expertise so that we can actually offer...
Fulfill a curriculum obligation.
Yeah. So I'd suggest that, and is that something that you've been focusing on at Hopkins? So
right now we're in the midst of a conversation that is underway and led by several of my colleagues, but around the idea of what a civics requirement, or we're calling it what a democracy requirement should look like within the institution. We recently established this institute, the Agora Institute, which is a wonderful project that we've been blessed to get funding for, which focuses on the challenges confronting contemporary democracy, and has now it's got about 14 tenure-line faculty. It's going to go to about 20. Broad range of different disciplines, broad range of political perspectives represented in that institute. they're going to start, they started this past year a minor that is related to the Institute that has a kind of a civics orientation to it. We're now thinking about whether or not the courses that are offered through that minor should actually be, students should be required to take at least one of them during their first year there at the university. So in some sense, we're thinking about the extent to which you can use this signaling about the importance of democracy, developing this kind of knowledge and these competencies, and then of course you got to make sure you can, in the way you've described, you can staff it with faculty. So it starts first with, is this, and it goes back to the challenge that in some sense I've sought to issue through the book. Are we in a moment where we ought to worry about whether or not we are properly, particularly in light of the deficit that the kids have when they come to the university, are we in a moment when we have to be teaching, educating for these issues? And if so, how do we do it? And then if so, how do we staff it? And so I think it all follows very logically. But it's a good point.
We have time for one more question.
I'm Nora Dean Leitner. I'm the president of St. John's College in Annapolis. So some of you are probably well familiar. I know President Daniels is that we are very much committed to liberal education. And in fact, the curriculum comes really, in a way, you could call it an anti-fascist curriculum from 1937. So the goal is to really educate critical thinkers. Not indoctrinate students, but let them really reach their own conclusions through an entirely discussion-based curriculum. So it's really very different from anything else anybody else is doing. And I have to admit, as an immigrant, what I love about American higher education is the panoply of opportunities and different ways of teaching, and obviously kind of the concept of a liberal arts college, which now is getting exported around the world, just as we seem to be retrenching or making the concept ever narrower. And it strikes me that we may not even be, we talk so much about what we're teaching, which obviously is very important, and our faculty would my faculty would very proudly tell you that we teach from Aristotle and Plato all the way to 20th century Supreme Court cases and things of that sort. But at the same time, I think we're not spending enough time talking about pedagogy. Or we're assuming, I think we're making assumptions about how everybody teaches. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about how large universities think about that. Where do you put your lecturers? Where do you put your teaching assistants? Because your PhD students versus your full-time faculty. I think all of these are really fascinating choices. We don't have to make them. We only have full-time tenure-track faculty who are in classrooms somewhere between 15 and 20 students. So easy in a way for us to have this all discussion and conversation and questioning based. But I'd love to hear how, as a president of a large university, you kind of thinking about those resource allocations.
So, probably one of the most consequential changes we've made over the last couple of years, and it actually grows from my experience as a lawyer, one-time law student. And one of the most powerful experiences I had at law school, and this is true for many of us who have had legal education, is the so-called first-year small group, where you take a number of your classes, and I took several classes which were 50 to 75. But the formative experience, at least for me in my first year, was in the small group. It was about 15 students. We were taught by a full-time faculty member. We met more frequently, and that's in truth where you learn to think really like a lawyer and to understand what the whole enterprise of law was about in legal reasoning and so forth. So fast forward many decades later, I thought, wouldn't it be great, just knowing how powerful that experience was for me as a law student, could we do the same thing at Hopkins? And could we, in fact, ensure that every student in the first year there at university has the same kind of small group, highly intimate experience, and taught by a tenure stream faculty member. And we had a report committed to that outcome a few years ago, and lo and behold, this past year, every student in our arts and sciences faculty we had about 80 sections we put out of courses that were these small group seminars that took on this character. And I think the program, it's been wonderful because it's been great for the students, but it's been really good for the faculty. And the faculty have actually not, rather than being resistant to this, they've been very enthusiastic. So it's things like that where you, again, to your point, if it's really important, you've got to figure out how you're going to move resources to it. You've got to prioritize it. You've got to basically reward the faculty and acknowledge the efforts they make in something like this. But I think that's been really effective. I'll just say the other thing that we're thinking a lot about, and it goes back to the responsibilities of representation, but questioning how you're doing in terms of full participation. And one of the areas where this university has changed very dramatically over the last decade plus has been in the percentage of Pell eligible students. Of course, Pell eligible, $60,000 of household income or less, students who are coming to the university. About the start of my presidency, it might have been about 10% of the class was Pell eligible. We're now 22% of the class is Pell eligible. About another 10% beyond that are the first generation of their family to go to university. And one of the things that we're starting to spend a lot of time on is how you actually rethink, given the background that these students have, how you think about the ways in which you can ensure full participation of those students in a program where they're cheek by jowl with students who have come from some of the most affluent communities in America, have had, have lots of AP course credits, have had, summer educational opportunities and so forth, and thinking again about this issue of how do you actually provide the kinds of things that, in a context of a wonderful liberal arts college that you're able to do, but in a setting of a large, complex research university. So again, it's resources, it's investment, it's thinking creatively about how you actually work really intentionally to ensure that although the students, show all the students we admit into the class show the necessary intellectual aptitude in the achievements, but the starting point is exactly the same. But how can you, over the period of 4 years, really give those students who are coming from these very different backgrounds the opportunities to really develop the kinds of achievements and the fulfillment that students from more privileged backgrounds have. So again, that's another area which we're working on.
Thank you. Well, we have to end the conversation now, but I do have some good news for you. This book, which you've heard me praise so highly, is free on the internet. It's proof that President Daniels is a real public servant. He has provided...
The royalty level was very low. This wasn't a big gift.
It gets zero. But you can download this from the Johns Hopkins University Press website if you like. And if you prefer a paper copy, we do have the opportunity for you to get a 30% discount also at the Johns Hopkins University Press site with the code HOWE, H-O-W-E, all caps, H-O-W-E. And if food for thought is not enough for you, for those of you present in the audience, we have actual food right beyond the doors. So after you join me in thanking President Daniels, please join me outside for some wine and cheese.
Thanks, Jenna. That was great. Thanks so much for the opportunity.